Coming up on Transformers University, we're headed back to Europe to meet the real European heroes. It's the first Transformers team up with Action Force right now on Transformers University. Hello, my friend, and welcome to Transformers University. This is episode 109. I am your host, Anthony Brucali, owner, operator, madman behind TFU.INFO, the website, the Tory Archive, this podcast, TFU News and Views podcast, and oh, so much more. You may recognize me from not being on the Hasbro PulseCon 2021 fan wall. I guess that's a story for another day, but the short answer there is... One, had a little bit of a connection. Actually, it's going to be kind of a long answer. Let's throw it in here anyway. One, had a little bit of a connection issue early on. Two, the timing of the event changed, which did not sit well with the timing for my day because three, my daughter turned 3. And that was her birthday. And so with her coming back from school and wanting to do all sorts of fun things, she had an amazing birthday. I have an amazing little girl. Because of that, I was in and out of the fan wall chat room. I did get to see most of the Transformers presentation. And you can tell by my Twitter timeline when I was on because I was live tweeting from my phone and grabbing screen caps because the in-house chat, the fan wall chat was just a tick ahead of the YouTube feed. But I digress. So yes, they didn't put everyone who participated up on the fan wall either. I guess that's something for the News and Views rant. Maybe for the next one, episode 51. We shall see. But today, we're going to talk a little bit about comics one more time. We're going to head back to the UK. And we're going to talk about Marvel UK issue 125 and Action Force issues 24 through 27. Now, those issues are not terribly long, at least not the parts that we need. And if you're wondering what Action Force is, so in Europe, Action Force eventually, without going through the long, detailed history of the G.I. Joe brand around the world, Action Force was the equivalent of the U.S.'s G.I. Joe in the 1980s. Why Action Force and not G.I. Joe? Well, G.I. Joe basically was a term used for Americans overseas. And so naming a bunch of soldiers who were then operating in Europe, G.I. Joe, becomes somewhat problematic in terms of marketing and in terms of just telling an actual story. So the European iteration of G.I. Joe is known as Action Force.
It's Action Force against Cobra, the enemy, fighting to save the day. They will never give up, they're always there, fighting for freedom over land and air. Action Force! International heroes! Action Force are there! Action Force will dare! Action Force!
Action Force is the codename for a highly trained rapid deployment force. Its purpose, to defend human freedom against Cobra, a ruthless terrorist organization.
Action Force! International heroes! Action Force will dare! Action Force!
And this is technically the first team-up of Transformers and G.I. Joe in the UK fiction because, as covered in a previous episode, the Marvel US G.I. Joe and the Transformers, I think I'm saying that title right. Sometimes it's and, sometimes it's versus. I'm pretty sure it's and. That series did not come out in Europe and actually was done as kind of like an Elseworlds, a what if, an alternate timeline story later on in Europe. But so for all intents and purposes, this in the UK continuity is the first time that our robots in disguise will meet the Action Force team. And it all begins in Marvel UK number 125. This one written by Simon Furman with art by Jeff Sr., inks by Dave Harwood, who we last saw back in the 1987 annual, letters by Anne Half a Cree, Half a Skrull, colors with a U by Steve White, and the cover by Jeff Anderson. And the story starts under London, where a scientist named Susan Hoffman has a team, and they're exploring these ancient Roman sewers that are beneath the city. Now, the name Susan Hoffman and her look is actually based off of the lead singer of The Bangles, Susanna Hoffs. Now, while Susan Hoffman is walking like an Egyptian under the streets of London, they get attacked by a robot and they get buried in the rubble. Her team gets buried in the rubble and she escapes. Back at the Ark, Grimlock tasks Wheeljack with repairing Centurion, who we've met many times now in this continuity. Blades is sent to London to investigate the robot attack. They think it might be Blaster and Goldbug having gone AWOL from Grimlock's command, as discussed earlier in our Marvel US comic episodes. And we return underground to find Action Force was sent in to find Hoffman's team with Hoffman. And the team that we have down under the sewers are Flint, Scarlet, Bazooka, Airtight, and Barbecue. So this team, they encounter Blades. They think this is the robot in question. Bazooka bazooks him, and Scarlet, for some reason, she's written very angry in the story. It's kind of, I don't know, off character for me. It just doesn't read properly. And I've read the Marvel, not the entire Marvel run, but I've read bits of the Marvel US run for G.I. Joe. And I know the cartoon pretty well. And yeah, it doesn't seem to fit with her personality. I guess because she's the redhead, she's the fiery one. But you know who's also fiery? Blades. And he gets angry and he starts to think about fighting back and shooting Action Force, but then comes to his senses and reasons with him. In the process, Blades gets shot in the back by Megatron.
Hey, want to help out this podcast or the website TFU.INFO? There's a number of ways you can do it. Let me tell you how. You can help us directly by joining our Patreon and enrolling as a student at Transformers University. There, you'll get early access to the podcast as well as exclusive behind-the-scenes peeks and perks for as little as $1 a month. Sign up is quick and easy. Just swing on by to www.patreon.com/TFUINFO. Another way you can help us is by using our Amazon link, www.tfu.info/Amazon. Type that into your browser whenever you want to shop at Amazon, and a portion of what you spend will be contributed back to us. It's that easy. Finally, you don't become the world's longest running transforming toy archive without some help from other fans. We're always on the hunt for photos of figures and accessories we're missing from our pages. If you'd like to contribute, go to tfu.info/help for a list of what we need, or send an email to info@tfu.info. tfu.info, the Alpha Trion and Omega Prime of transforming toys. Now, back to the show.
And that takes us to Action Force number 24. Now, the creative team, all the same here, so we'll just talk about the new covers as we go. And this one, covered by Lee Sullivan. They recap the story on the first page as Action Force runs away to the surface in order to get away from the robot battle. They encounter Grimlock and Centurion on the surface, and Megatron and Grimlock fight. Flint calls in an airstrike of helicopters, but Meg shoots them down, including Wild Bill. And that'll take us to Action Force number 25. Oh boy, this title's called Going Down. And and while it does not feature Batman on the cover, it does feature Wild Bill falling through the sky. And this one's by Jeff Anderson. And we start again with a recap, and then Blades emerges from underground. Grimlock continues to fight Megatron, and Blades rescues Wild Bill. From here, Flint calls in a tank strike, calls in a batch of maulers. Wild Bill arrives to tell Flint to call them off. And that is the end of issue 25 of Action Force. Told you, we're going through this pretty quickly because they're not terribly long. They're 6-page comics and 1 page is usually a recap. So we head on to Action Force number 26. Once again, we start with a recap as Megatron destroys the Maulers. The Centurion, he is there, but he is frozen, remembering how Megatron nearly killed him in their last encounter. The fight between Megatron and Grimlock starts to spill into a natural gas facility. And as that fight does, Wild Bill wants to go in and rescue Grimlock from this battle and this dangerous situation. Flint, though, decides to call in an air raid of Sky Strikers. Noticing a pattern here with Flint, are you? Because that takes us to issue number 27, because Wild Bill is not happy. He remembers serving in Southeast Asia. So Wild Bill is a Vietnam vet, though he is British here and not American. So he, I think I read somewhere he's from Hull. So Wild Bill was doing like a soldier exchange program, I guess, when he was serving in Vietnam. In this mission in Southeast Asia, they rescued 6 of 7 folks, but the 7th was killed in a friendly airstrike. So this is kind of hitting home for Wild Bill, and he will not trade in Grimlock for killing Megatron. He turns to Centurion and yells at him, trying to get him in the fight, and Blades has an idea. He airdrops Centurion into the battle and pulls Grimlock out. The Sky Strikers strike, and Megatron and Centurion both fall into the Thames River, and they fall in burning and on fire. And Blades and the Action Force team salute them. And that is the end of this quick little crossover between the Transformers and Action Force.
General Hawk, do you read me? This is Doc at headquarters. Great news. Duke's come out of his coma.
Looks like we made it. Men, Doc says Duke's gonna be A-OK.
Before I get into my thoughts on this comic series, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Chris McLeod, a.k.a. Diagnostic 80. You might know him from his podcast, The Full Force. I've appeared on it a number of times. Chris was so kind as to record his memories and thoughts on the Transformers Action Force team-up.
Hi there, Chris McLeod, a.k.a. Diagnostic 80 from the Full Force podcast here, and I've been asked by my good friend Ant to give my specific thoughts about the shared story arc between the old Marvel UK Action Force and the Transformers comics Ancient Relics. In my much smaller and less experienced human form, I was a huge fan of both Action Force and Transformers properties, as most kids were of my age back in the day. Back then, comics, magazines and VHS tapes were our generation's internet. Other than the toy aisles themselves, it's where we received all information regarding these amazing brands. I was active in my comic reading, but I will say that living in a very small seaside village in the middle of nowhere, Norfolk, United Kingdom, meant that getting these comics wasn't always set in stone. I say this because even though I would be in our local newsagents on a daily basis, it wouldn't always guarantee that I would get my hands on the latest Action Force comic, and I have to admit I rarely saw the Transformers ones at all. I knew they existed, and I even had a few, and wanted to read them desperately. Even ordering them wasn't reliable. Therefore, when I picked up issue number 24 of Action Force and began to read a story that seemingly came out of nowhere, I could be forgiven for thinking I'd missed an issue or two. That was all forgotten rather quickly, however, as I realised that 2 of my favourite toy lines and cartoons were combining in a pretty big way. I was arguably the biggest fan of Action Force in my school. Actually, scratch that, I was the biggest fan, hands down. I knew every character, their specialties, and had a huge amount of the toys and merchandise. I was also the sole person who would rent out the Action Force movie and the double feature of Captives of Cobra and Ode to Cobra from our local video shop every single weekend. How had I dropped the ball on this epic situation? Well, turned out the first part of this story featured in the Transformers comic number 125, and thanks to a friend at school who had that first part of the puzzle, I got to read how this all came about properly. I was pumped, and further down the road managed to pick that single Transformers issue up myself to complete the collection. Now, a lot of people bemoan the joining of these two brands and didn't enjoy the crossover in the UK comics, and to those people I say, Well, have a nice day, but I loved it and I was on the edge of my seat reading the story that would culminate in the apparent, at the time, deaths of a brand new character, Centurion, and old-timer Megatron, who were both missiled into a fireball when Centurion sacrificed himself in order to keep Megs in the line of fire and clear of everybody else. I was even inspired so much by the heroism of Centurion that I designed my own Transformer in a drawing I have to this day. Maybe I'll show that off at some point in the future. Nowadays, I spend a surprising amount of my time reading the old Action Force comics all the way through, and I always throw in Transformers issue 125 for good measure. If that isn't a testament to the quality of these awesome comics, I don't know what is.
So, my thoughts on this, there's a couple of weird things here. Flint's job, essentially, in this entire story is to make phone calls. I know he's a leader, but it's just like, it's calling the airstrike, calling the Maulers, calling the helicopters. It's bizarre. I guess it makes sense in terms of a story, but I feel like Flint is meant for so much more, and he's kind of underutilized here. It's weird that they don't want to sacrifice Grimlock, but it's okay to sacrifice Centurion. I guess, Furman has to weave Centurion in and out of the story because the U.S. issues are going to come in, and of course you have to keep Grimlock alive. So it's an interesting trade-off. You're starting to watch this, I'm starting to watch this in the context of how does Simon Furman and the team dance between the issues? Because at some point the story has to reset to a place that is consistent with the U.S. run. So now Megatron, who had blown himself up in the space bridge, is now missing under the Thames. Okay, they're going to have to find a way to get him to wherever he ends up in the U.S. book. But they have time to do that now. Same thing for Centurion, right? We can destroy him and take him out of the story, and he won't matter in the U.S. issues because he doesn't exist in the U.S. issues. And if they want to bring him back in the middle somewhere, they can. And I'm just looking at my other notes here, and it's all things I covered: Wild Bill in Vietnam and Angry Scarlet, which just weirdly sits with me, and that this exists in place of the Joe and Transformers crossover we covered in the 1986 year of this show. Gotta say, I was a little disappointed with the series, with this crossover. Not that it was hyped up much. It's kind of a forgettable story. Not a lot happens, and the fact that it takes place in Europe kind of overcomplicates the G.I. Joe interaction. On the other hand, it's kind of cool seeing Blades get a feature issue and having a bit of a story around him, because he rarely shows up in anything that isn't where he's just meant to be part of Defensor. So it was pretty cool just having him in the tail. Now, before I forget, if you want to catch Chris's podcast, you can pretty much find it everywhere you can find this one. It's called The Full Force. It is a fantastic look into G.I. Joe fandom, especially now where G.I. Joe as a license is on fire. And it feels like Hasbro's licensing G.I. Joe Transformers to anyone that can pay for it. But that said, the G.I. Joe Classified line, I find myself trying hard not to collect it because I don't want to purchase every figure, but I do end up buying more than my fair share. It's kind of like Masters of the Universe Origins, too, to some extent. Like, I'm really trying to cherry pick those lines. And if you swing on over to the Twitter, you may see some photos of my collection of those lines plus Transformers, plus you get to interact with me. Here's all the details.
Thanks for listening to the show. Stick around to hear what's coming up next episode, but first, I want to fill you in on a few ways you can stay in touch with the show. Want to be on the show? Leave us a voicemail at 702-763-4838. That's 702-POD4TFU. Or send an email to info@TFU.INFO. Be sure to catch us on Twitter at TFU_info and on Facebook and Instagram under the username TFU.INFO, all one word. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TFU.INFO, where we post all of our podcasts plus special video segments, reviews, and live coverage of Transformers-related events such as New York Toy Fair and New York Comic-Con. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit us at www.tfu.info, the world's longest-running transforming toy archive.
And that will wrap up this episode of Transformers University. coming up in episode 110, we're staying in Europe for a little while, and we're going to talk a little bit about 1987 and the Ladybird books in Europe in 1987. This is going to be actually pretty fun because we get books with stories with the 1987 characters, which we don't normally see from here on out. Once the cartoon ends, right, the ancillary media starts to go away, and Ladybird is actually fairly consistent in staying around through G1. So we'll have some stories involving Headmasters and Target Masters and the planet Nebulos, and we'll talk about those next time on the show. So until next time on the show, I am your host, Anthony Brucali, owner, operator, madman behind TFU.INFO. Until then, see ya.